I've been really fortunate in that I've never had to buy a table saw for my workshop. I started off with the little Ryobi 10-inch table saw here that my friend Hans gave me when he moved to Los Angeles. And I was really thrilled to get this. It added a capability to my workshop that I'd never had before, and it was super useful to have. But back in the fall, my friend Joe offered to trade me this old Craftsman contractor saw for the Ryobi because he wanted a benchtop saw and didn't want the larger Craftsman. So I gladly accepted it because the Craftsman is much bigger, it's got a cast iron top, and a nice heavy duty motor, but I noticed it could use a few improvements. So one thing I did early was construct a zero clearance insert throat plate for it, and I like that a lot. That really helps for small pieces especially, but I wanted to tackle the problem of vibration. So back in December, I ordered a set of these pulleys and a set of V-belts from Inline Industries. These are beautiful machined pulleys to replace the old stamped pulleys that were on the Craftsman originally. So I set off to take those off, and the one that was on the motor came off pretty easily, but the pulley that was on the saw blade's arbor was really a pain. Just loosening the Allen bolt and then trying to pull it off didn't work at all, so I soaked it in WD-40 and tried kind of banging on it to get it off, and really that didn't work at all. So I ended up, on the advice of some friends, getting a gear puller from AutoZone. And they have a nice program where you can just buy this thing and then return it. They know that people want to use it for one-time tasks typically. And this was the first time I've ever tried using that tool, and it was kind of a pain to figure out how to get it to work. But eventually I got it on there, and it was really difficult at first because I didn't realize that I hadn't tilted the saw arbor far down enough. I thought I was going to have to go through the body of the saw. It was a pain trying to work in those close quarters. But finally, after a lot of monkeying around, I got it off. And there's the old stamped pulley that I'm going to replace. Once I had gotten the old pulley off, I realized that I actually needed to do a little cleanup on both the motor and, to a lesser degree, the saw arbor as well to get it to fit. There were probably decades of crud kind of built up on the shaft of that motor. So I actually hit it with the random orbit sander for a bit, and then a little bit of hand sanding as well, and just to clean up that shaft enough for the pulley to slide on there. It's manufactured to pretty tight tolerances, so it really wouldn't go on at all at first with all of the corrosion and buildup that had been on the shaft of that motor. But after some cleanup, I did finally get that on, and you can see it slide onto the shaft of the motor right there. Next was putting on the V-belt, and I'd never used one of these before, but I'd really heard good things about their ability to reduce vibration, and that was certainly one of the issues I was trying to improve on this saw. So after spending a little time trying to figure out how the links all fit together, I got the belt down to the size that I wanted to for the saw. This saw is particular in that the weight of the motor helps with tensioning the belt, and so getting the length of the belt just right is pretty important so that the motor, the weight of the motor provides enough tension on the belt for the saw to run smoothly. So getting it snapped together and then turned inside out and fitted on there felt pretty good. It was a little bit of work, but in the end I think the link belt really did make some nice improvements in terms of reducing the vibration. Another thing that I wanted to do to the saw was make sure that the motor was running well, and my brother-in-law had showed me that you can pop these little yellow caps off of the motor, and that's a spot to add some oil. So I just added a couple drops of oil to each of those oil reservoirs to make sure that the motor was running nice and smoothly, and that also seems to have made a nice difference in terms of the vibration of the motor. So once I had everything all assembled, the next step, of course, was to plug it in and try it out to make sure that everything was running smoothly. And I have to say, the first time that I fired it up, it was really gratifying. There was a big cloud of sawdust that came out of the motor there, so I ended up going back and getting the shop vac to clean that up some. But it was really gratifying to see the reduction in vibration and to feel like this tool was really improved by the work that I had put into it. The next thing I wanted to tackle was cleaning up the cast iron top, and I read a bunch of articles online and initially tried some WD-40 and steel wool, or just cleaning it off, and that didn't touch the top of this at all. So maybe against my better judgment, I thought I would try some really fine grit sandpaper. And I started off with my quarter sheet sander with, I think, 320 grit. And immediately I could see a bunch of rust coming off. So I had a feeling that it was going to take more if I was going to go with sanding than just the steel wool. So I went actually to the random orbit sander then and tried a couple of different grits. And I actually started with the highest grits that I thought I could get away with and ended up actually working all the way down to 150. And I, of course, if I had known that after the fact, I probably would have started with a lower grit. And looking back on this, I'm not sure this was really the best way to clean off the tabletop saw in terms of appearance. It certainly took the rust off of the surface, and even after I did just a couple of passes with the 150 grit, it really had made a huge improvement in terms of how easy it was to move across the tabletop, because the old tabletop, the old cast iron top with its patina of stuff that had built up, rust and whatever else, it really took some effort to slide wood across it. But cleaning it up with the sandpaper immediately made that better. Now, I will say that using the random orbit sander probably left some scratches on the tabletop. And this is a mid-1970s, I think, vintage Craftsman table saw. So the fact that the tabletop doesn't look perfect isn't a huge problem for me. You know, I would love to have a beautiful gleaming cast iron top, but the fact that the tool is so much more functional now is really the most important thing to me. So I actually went through everywhere on the saw that I could to try and improve, especially the rails here. The fence never slid very well, and I realized partly it was because there was just a bunch of crud built up on there as well. Now, I did take some paint off of there, but I think it was well worth it in terms of the improvement of being able to slide the fence over. So there's some more sandpaper that got used for that whole thing. Towards the end, I decided to go back and try one last layer of steel wool. So I went over it with 00 grit steel wool, and you can see the results there. I really burned through a lot of stuff here. And then finally I wanted to clean the surface back up, so I used some more WD-40 back at the end and a cloth to wipe it off. I actually had to go through this process a couple of times because the next and final step for this was putting on paste wax. And I started to put on a layer of paste wax, and I realized that the cloth was getting dirty, which meant there was still dirt and grime and whatever built up on the tabletop surface. So I had to go back and clean that up a second time with WD-40. But then the last step, like I said, was to get some paste wax on there. And again, this is the first time I've ever tried this because this is the first tool I've ever owned with a cast iron top. So it took a little bit of work to figure out what the best way was to apply the wax. And this is just the brand that you saw in the shot there. It's Minwax finishing paste wax. I rubbed it on and then let it haze up and then buffed it off to get a nice smooth surface on the top. Here you can see me buffing it back out after it's dried and buffing off the rails of the table saw sled as well. Once the wax was on, I felt like it was just about ready to go, so I raised the blade, and I really wanted to make sure that the blade was perfectly perpendicular to the cast iron top after all of the work I had done in adding the pulleys and all of that. I wanted to make sure it was perfectly good. So I got it set up with a square, dropped the zero clearance insert plate back in there, and you can see hopefully there how much easier that fence moves now with the improvements from the rails. If I was going to spend any more money upgrading this saw, the next big thing really would be to get a new fence system. This is not a great fence system because it always wants to move a little bit out of parallel to the blade, so I always have to use a square to double check that it's perfectly parallel to the blade. But I'm not sure that I really want to spend a couple $100 on a nice Biesemeyer or other fence when the value of the saw probably doesn't warrant putting that work in. But anyway, once I had the fence in place, it was time to fire it up for the first time and actually make a test cut with the saw and its new improvement. So I locked the fence down and ran a test cut through, and I have to say I was really, really pleased at how well it worked. This table saw is working better than it ever has before. It's pretty sweet. Top feels great. Fence slides smoothly. Cuts nicely. Lots less vibration. Good deal. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to my YouTube channel or check me out on Instagram @BillVanLoo.